I'm Amanda, and this is Not Your Granny's Quilt Show. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to today's episode. I am so excited to share with you that I have Janice of Prairie and Ocean on today. She is a fantastic pattern designer out of Canada. I don't know how else to describe her quilts, just stunning, besides just stunning. She just released a new pattern called Saros, and it is gorgeous. If you have not seen it, go check it out. She's got Instagram at Prairie and Ocean and her website, prairieandocean.com. You can check out all of her stuff. And in the meantime, while you're doing that, you can listen to our chat about her quilting journey, how she got into designing, and all of that fun stuff. So let's get into it. Did you know there's new merch in the merch shop? That's all right. We've got new stuff, new mugs, new stickers, some new shirts, some new hoodies, and I just love all of it. So get in there, get some merch, get some swag, get some stickers. I don't know, do whatever you want. But to get that, go to nygqs.printify.me to shop today. And now back to the show. Well, hi there, Janice. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm I don't know. It started snowing this morning and I was like, I quit. I fucking quit. So anyway, it's fine. But I'm
Honestly, I
glad.
would have loved some snow. So
Yeah. It was raining and I was like, oh wow. And then I looked out the window like 30 seconds later and it was like big flat flakes. And I was like, okay. So it's fine. We were just in like the 60s last week. So it's abrupt. But
I
anyway.
don't actually know what that means. I'm a Celsius girl here.
Oh, yeah. I don't know what would 60 degrees be in Celsius. I don't know.
No,
It's
I lived in
mid.
San Diego for 3 years and I still never converted.
Oh, you're like, I don't know. It was like mild, starting to feel warm, like spring
All right. Cool.
temperatures, early spring. Anywho, well, I'm super glad we're here today. I am so excited to talk to you. We have so many things to cover. But first, we're going to start with where you started quilting. You mentioned San Diego, and I had read that that's when you started quilting, was when you lived in San Diego.
Yeah. So I actually come from a family of quilters. So I've been around quilting my whole life, but I was always really adamant that I wasn't going to learn how to quilt. I just had no interest in it. I'd have sleepovers at my aunt's place and she'd be like, Janice, let's quilt. I'm like, nah,
Hmm.
that's fine. I don't really want to. But yeah, so after I finished my PhD, I moved down to San Diego from Canada to do a postdoc there. And I all of a sudden was just like, I had a lot of time on my hands. So after I finished my PhD, I'd been working 14-hour days, and I was just like, no, I'm done with that. I'm gonna take time for myself. What am I gonna do? And I had done a lot of crochet and embroidery before that. So I really liked using my hands
Mhm.
and I guess fiber arts. Let's put it into that category. And I came across something called the Crafters Box.
Mhm.
Um, they've gotten really huge since 2018, which is when I started doing
Mhm.
this, but they had this whole cloth quilt.
Oh.
And I was just like, oh, it's not really quilting. It's more like embroidery than quilting. So I was like, okay, let's try this out. So I got this kit and I was just got hooked on it. And I was calling my mom, being like, how do I bind this? And I was super confused and just asking all these questions. And so I finished that maybe in November or something like that. And then I went home for Christmas. And my mom was like, so you really like the handwork part of it? It's like, yeah, I really liked hand stitching. It was a lot of fun.
Mhm.
She's like, you should try English paper piecing.
Mm.
Well, what is that? And so she had some hexes. And so over Christmas, I made this little I don't know, little quilt of hexes. And I was like, oh, this is super fun. And so when I got back to San Diego, my aunt came to visit me and we went to a quilt shop together and I bought all this fabric and I decided I was going to be an English paper piecer quilter or something like that.
Yeah.
And so my first real quilt was all done by EPP.
Wow.
And then by the end of it, I was just like, "I can't sustain this, I need a sewing machine."
Yeah.
So I bought myself a sewing machine and it's stuck since then.
Wow. That's a commitment. Like, I've only done one project with EPP, and it was just like a little wreath, and that was it, and I was like, "Wow." It's fun, but yeah, to commit to a whole quilt.
No, I loved it. I loved it.
Yeah.
I just like sat outside and like podcast and listened to audiobooks and just like sewed. It was just like pinwheels together, like nothing crazy or anything like that, but
Yeah.
I was very hooked.
Yeah. That's so fun. And, like, funny that the handwork pulled you in even though you were like, "I'm not quilting ever," but it's like snares people somehow, almost always, like, if they've got it in their life somehow, it, like, pulls you in at some point, whether you want it to or not.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many parallels to like the things I loved about crochet and hand embroidery that it just
Mhm.
was a natural, and I guess, transition to quilting.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, and
Yeah.
I hated hand embroidery. No, not just embroidery, because I hated hoops. So I was just like, why am I doing this? And I don't actually like the end thing. Well, with a quilt, it's super cozy and wonderful.
Right. You at least get something more, like, functional out of it
Yeah.
versus just, like I mean, not that art's not functional, but it's more functional art than an embroidery piece maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. And then what prompted you to start designing? Like, how quickly into quilting were you like, "I'm gonna make my own?"
So I figured this question would be asked. So I was kind of like thinking about it.
Mhm,
Um, And what I find funny is that when I first started quilting, I just made my own things. Like it was like just sewing HSTs together. It was nothing like groundbreaking. I don't think my quilts now are groundbreaking, but like it wasn't anything fancy or anything.
mhm,
And then I started pattern testing pretty close to when I started actually quilting. Like right after I bought my machine, I started pattern testing. And
mhm.
that was great for learning foundations, like how to make flying geese and like get
Yeah,
an actual skill set.
yeah.
Um, and I really enjoyed that part of it, but I quit making my own quilts once I started pattern testing.
Mhm.
And then I had some friends who um, were expecting twins, so I wanted to make them baby blankets. And I had started, I think I had pattern tested apples and beavers had like this castle block or something like
Yeah,
that. And so
yeah.
I had the castle blocks and I was going to put them together with um, pen and paper's tiny town pattern. And I was just like, oh, there's a castle. It'd be really cool if there's a dragon in here.
Mhm.
And then I was just like, oh, but there's like no dragon blocks around. And someone encouraged me to make a dragon. I'm pretty sure it was Astrid actually from Apples and Beavers to like make this dragon. So I made this dragon block.
Yeah.
It took a lot of like time to do, but like I really loved him. And then people just kind of started encouraging me and being like, you should write this up as a pattern. And I was like, "What? I don't know." But I started doing it and I ended up loving the process. Um, but because I was in San Diego at the time, and the visa that I was on to be there, I couldn't like start a quilting business
Mhm.
because of visa restrictions.
Sure.
And so that just kind of like I released the pattern as a fundraiser. So I wasn't actually making money off of it, but it was a way of
Mhm.
fundraising for Feed America.
Mm.
And that just kind of like sat for, that was 20, maybe a year or two or something like that, where I wasn't doing any other designing. I went back to pattern testing, didn't really think about it. And then Gloria of Kate and Birdie, she designs fabrics for Trentex, I believe.
Oh, okay.
She had reached out to me and she was designing this new line and she wanted me to make a sample with her fabric. And
Mm.
she's like, I'd like you to use a pattern from a Canadian designer. You can choose what you want to do. And I was like, well, I'm Canadian. Maybe design something. And that whole thing just kickstarted Prairie and Ocean. So
Wow.
my first pattern, Strickland, was made for that fabric line. And then it just kind of carried on from there, where um, I wasn't getting a lot of like creative fulfillment from making other people's patterns, but suddenly when I was starting to make my own patterns, I was starting to find quilting fun again. So
Mhm. Yeah, that's so cool, and your patterns are stunning. I just when
thank
I
you.
was looking, you know, when I was my attention was turned to you and I was introduced to your work, I was looking through them and I was just like, "Oh, man, these are they're stunning." So, and, you just released one, called Saros?
Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, I'm just in awe of designer because I it does take so much work and I make other people's patterns all the time, and some of the time when I'm not using someone else's pattern, it's just simple patchwork where I'm just throwing together a t-shirt quilt for clients, but I still like, it still isn't in me to, like, start designing my own because I think there's so many other patterns that do speak to me, so I think the people who are out there, like, designing and putting these beautiful things into the world so the rest of us can make them is just, like, I'm always gonna be, like, bowing down because not to say that it never will happen, but, it's just not in my purview right now, but I just still every time am just so in awe that, you put in the work and do all the quilty math and put these beautiful things together for others, and it's such a generous thing, not that, it's free, but it's still generous that you're sharing your art with the world and with the quilty world specifically, like, we get to look at such beautiful things because people like you do what you do, so thank you.
I think it goes both ways. Like I'm I find it absolutely nuts when someone uses my quilt pattern and actually makes it. Like, I know a lot of people just buy patterns and it sits in their pattern stash, but when someone actually, like, invests their time and their money into making a quilt, like, it's insane. It's so cool. So,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, we all need each other for sure, and it's like, obviously, we wouldn't have designers without makers, and we won't have makers without designers, so, like and, you know, I it's just what am I trying to say? My brain just jumbled. Like, I've said it, multiple times, but it still rings true, and I'm just more and more convinced all the time that, like, when people share their creativity, it just, like, creates more creativity, like and
I love that.
it's like people question, like, "Well, are there too many designers out there? Are there too many?" It's like, "No, there's an infinite amount of designs out there. There's an infinite number of iterations of things, like, we can keep making forever because there's no limit to it, and I love to see it because, again, back to that concept, like, the more creativity that gets shown or the more people share their ideas, the more it inspires other people to make those things or to put their own creativity into it, put a twist on it, and maybe give it a different life than the original designer had in mind for it. And you just don't know where it's going to go. So it's just magic. Like, I think quilting is magic, and I know it's math and sewing and science and fabric, but there's just something so magic in the design of it and in the creation of it, and it's such a special thing, and it's so fun to be a part of, and meeting all the people who make it happen has just been so cool for me, but also, like, so fun to be a part of and see happen all the time.
Yeah, one of, my second quilt pattern one of my favorite things is when someone takes one of my patterns and just runs with it and does
Mhm,
like, puts their own spin on it and just I don't know, I feel like a pattern's job is to inspire creativity, like, you don't have to copy what I've done, but if you can use it as a stepping stone for making your own thing,
mhm.
that's, like, chef's kiss, like, that makes my day so much.
Yeah.
But with my second pattern, aperiodic, one of my, testers took it and just totally ran with it. And it doesn't really look like my original pattern anymore, but she used it
Mhm.
and just came up with this mind blowing design that was just like, for me, it was really fulfilling just being like, I can't believe that came from something I wrote.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You're totally right that creativity inspires creativity.
Yeah. I'm glad for it because I think we need more beautiful things in the world. And the more people are willing to make that happen, I think the better off we're all going to be having it in our lives. So it's good. It's good stuff. So, okay, so you mentioned you got your PhD, and what is the field that you work in, your PhD field?
I'm a biochemist. So
Oh,
specifically, I'm a structural biologist, but I basically look at molecules and how they work in our bodies. So I do drug discovery research now. So
mm, wow,
uh,
that's really cool.
it's a lot of science, a lot of like analytical thinking, a lot of math, and it pairs really well with quilting.
I was gonna say quilting is very mathy, and like people who poo-poo it or like kind of turn their nose down to like, oh, you're just a quilter. I'm like, do you even know how much math I do every dang time I make a quilt? Like, it's crazy how much actual deep thinking goes into it. And the fact that it just gets written off by so many people, like, oh, that's a woman's craft. I'm like, yeah, because we're badass. Like, we're smart. And, or when people are like, oh, I'm not good at math, but then they come up with these like ridiculous quilt patterns or they just make these amazing quilts. I'm like, that took so much math. What do you mean you're bad at math? Like, stop saying that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that there's a certain way to do math. Like
Mhm,
in school, you're like taught to do like this way of math. But
mhm.
like you look at how math is being taught now, like I look at how my nephews are taught math, and it's totally different than how I learned math. So like there
Yeah.
is one way to do it. So like if the way that you do math doesn't fit the box of math, then like who cares? You still get the end result. So
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I think people don't give themselves enough credit when it comes to figuring things out.
Yeah. I agree with you. And I was in that boat for so long. Used to think I was terrible at math, used to think I wasn't good at problem solving and all these things. But once I started getting deeper into my education degree and like learning how to teach math and learning how to teach all these different concepts, I was like, oh, I'm not bad at it. I just didn't have a very good foundation of like how to do these things. And so it really like drove home for me the importance of showing people that there's multiple ways to get somewhere. It's not just A to B. It's like you can get there in again an infinite number of ways. And especially, teaching and learn. I never one time in my classroom said I was bad at math. I refused to like let that take over my brain because I had heard so many teachers say it before, like, well, I'm just so bad at math. I'm like, no, you're not. You're a teacher. Like, you know how to teach arithmetic. I mean, it was elementary, so it's arithmetic, but still, those concepts are foundational. And if you can master those, or if you can learn how to be a problem solver versus just being super fast at calculating arithmetic facts, like, then you're going to have a leg to stand on in this world. And I think that's where the emphasis is now trying to be in teaching is the problem solving aspect. And it's that's where like confidence comes from, I think, too, is knowing how to approach a problem or having some sense of like what to do if you face something that is new and unknown. And I think it shows up in quilting too all the time because if you're making a new pattern or trying a new skill or whatever, if you're averse to like I used to be fucking up all the time and like just avoiding things. I avoided learning to really sew until I was in my early 30s. Like my mom has sewn my entire life and since she was a young child and I've always been around it, but I was so afraid of messing up her machine or ruining whatever I was trying to make that I just was like, I can't do this. And
Yeah.
I avoided it for so long until two of my best friends were like, you're gonna make a quilt. We're taking you to the store, we're buying fabric, we're picking a pattern. So of course I was like, well, I'm going to make yellow brick road pattern and I'm going to make a twin size because if I'm making a quilt, I want to make it big. And they
You
were
went all
like,
in.
yeah, they were like, okay. And they're like, it's so easy. It's so easy. Well, I had to learn how to like cut fabric. I had only ever really seen garment cutting, like putting a pattern down using
Yeah.
scissors. And they were like, this is a ruler. This is a rotary cutter. This is how you line it up with your cutting mat. This is how you square your fabric. This is how I was like, what? Anyway, and like quilting coupled with getting my master's degree were two of the things in my life that have given me the most confidence or like built my confidence to the point where I'm like not really that scared to try new things anymore. Because with quilting, you have to just do it. It's like if you don't try this thing or don't follow the directions or learn what they mean, then you can't make the thing you want to make. So, and I
Yeah, I
was,
really find it interesting how many lessons there are within quilting. Like you said, problem solving. I was thinking back to some of my first quilts that I ever made where I couldn't do a seam allowance, and I had all of these blocks that were off by like half an inch from each other. And it was just like, okay, how do I put this together? And you have to like think it through and figure it
yeah.
out. And there's math involved in that. And there's like you might
Mhm.
not consciously realize that there is, but there is. And um,
Yeah.
I know for me, I'm very much a perfectionist, and quilting has taught me to let that go.
Yeah.
And there are times where I'm a perfectionist, but um, my aunt once told me that when she taught quilting classes, she would only allow her students to use their seam ripper once. Like if it was like a gigantic mistake, then sure. But if
Yeah.
it was just like, oh, your points are off a little bit, she'd make them keep it in there.
Yeah.
And so, like, I keep that in my head while I'm quilting, just being like, it's okay, just let it go, it's fine. Um, but yeah, it's really helped me like let go of that type A personality trait in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm the same way. I used to fight and get so upset if everything wasn't perfect. And again, it was came down to I wasn't paying attention to seam allowance. They were either so scant that they've now come apart and I've had to like
There.
hand sew and repair some of my first quilts and or yeah, I just was being lazy and not really making sure that they were 1/4 inch so they're bigger seam allowance and so but it's one of those things too where I was like I am not seam ripping that. It's staying. Like I was not perfectionist enough. Like I would lean more into, like, kind of the laziness of, like, not wanting to go through all that work to resew everything. So but it has really taught me to just, like, read the directions first,
Read them again.
and then read them again, and also keep reading them as you're going, and follow your seam allowance, and then just let the rest go, like, nothing's perfect, and it was funny because while I was teaching I was teaching the long arming classes, the certifications at one of our local quilt shops. I would tell them all the time because they'd get so mad when their pantographs didn't look very nice. I'm like, "How many times have you done this before?" They're like, "Well, this is obviously my first time." I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool. I just wanted to check because I thought, like, maybe by the way you're talking, you're, like, really learned at this and, like, you should be better, but this is your first time." They're like, "Okay, okay." I just like, "No," and any little wobble or any difference in, you're literally tracing a design and any difference in it is the humanness. Like, you're not a machine, you're not a robot, you're using a machine, but you're still a person, and any inconsistency is just you in that quilt now. It's like, that's where the humanness comes in, that's where the love is, like, you're making this for someone or, will be making a quilt for someone, and you're putting a little bit of you in it every time you do this, and they were like, "Oh," and I was like, I should take my own advice." I'm like
That-
telling other people that, but then I go home and I'm like, "Oh, it's a piece of trash." If
Yeah,
any points are off or seams are, it's like, ugh, but
I recently taught my husband how to quilt. We made a quilt together, and it's just like so fascinating watching him do this because he's going through the same things that I went through where it's just like, "Oh, well, this doesn't match," or
Mhm.
like, "This piece is, like, way off from this one. What are we gonna do?" And it's just like, "Chill. We'll figure it out. It's gonna look amazing.
Yeah.
You might have a couple busted seams, and that's okay. We'll fix them after that." Like,
Mhm.
I don't know. It was cool to see how far he came, but also how far I've come just by watching him. Because you kind
Yeah.
of forget what you were like as a beginner quilter.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I started teaching my husband too, like, I even have a couple videos of the process with him, like, we shopped fabric, we cut it, we just have to put it together, but then he started a master's degree, and it's like, that's not as important, but literally, as I was, like, teaching him just how a sewing machine works and showing him how to use or, create a quarter inch seam, and you gotta keep with the seam allowance, he got it right away, and he loves to build things. He's got a math degree, a computer science degree, and now he's getting a master's in counseling, so he's a smart guy, but, it was just funny because he, like, immediately built a box. I was like, "What?" He's like, "Oh, and then we can sew this, and then I can sew this on here, and then I can make a box," and I was like, "You sure can," like, it wasn't even like, "Oh, I can't make my seam straight." But then my little sister, she's been living at my parents' house for the last few months, and she was like, "Okay, I wanna start making quilts." And so but then now helping her, it's, like, kinda that same thing. It's like, "Okay." She's like, "Oh my gosh, my seams are off." So I showed her how to, like, pin across the seams and, like, it'll even itself out, it'll be fine, and, nesting your seams and in her first quilt she made was, like, applique hearts, so of course she picked the hardest thing ever to do her first quilt,
Yeah, no
but then
kidding.
yeah, and it took her forever, and then for second quilt, she used a layer cake and then cut 5-inch squares out of some yardage that I had, and I was like, "You're gonna make X's and O's, just simple pattern," because she's like, "I wanna make a second quilt before I move out," and I was like, "Okay, great." And I was like, "You're gonna scream when this is done so fast." And so my mom was out of town recently, and I was like, "Okay, get up here and sew with me while she's gone so we have the whole room and whatever." She's like, "Okay." So she gets it done. She's like putting it up on the design wall. She steps back and she looked at me and she goes, "Oh my God." I was like, "I told you." But just like that fun, like, joy of her, like, experiencing all these things for the first time or just, like,
Oh, yeah.
again, the times of, like, when she messes something up or thinks that she messed something up and her hesitation, but she's also super smart and a good problem solver, so then she'll be like, "Oh, wait, I think if I just do this," like, she's, like, starting to see how things kinda work together and figuring it out, which is, like it's just been so fun, like, having this time to sew with her and her get into it a little more and more as she's, like, watched my mom and I do it for the last 6 years, and
Yeah.
so, anyway, it's just such a joyful thing, I think, and once like you said, once you can kinda drop your perfectionism, if you've got it, then it becomes a lot easier to just make for the joy of it instead of being worried about it being perfect.
Yeah. I really like how tangible quilts are, where, like, you see the progress and where it's just, like especially, like, a lot of quilts, once you get past making, like, all the HSTs and flying geese, it just comes together really quickly where you're just like it's kind of a slog, and then all of a sudden it's done, and you're like, "Holy crap."
Yeah.
I just made this, and it feels like I don't know, there's just a lot of I'm blanking on the word, but
Yeah.
fulfillment, I don't know,
Yeah.
pride, uh I'll think about the word eventually, but
It'll
it's
come
just
to you.
really wonderful to be able to make something.
Yeah, it really is, and you're right, it's like once you get through all the chain piecing and all the sewing of all the little bits and all the blocks start to come together, it just that's where I start to get excited. I'm not a big fan of piecing, like, obviously, I'll do it, and I do it, but I know the end result is, like, where I'm trying to get, so that's kinda what keeps me moving, and I love long arming, it's my most favorite part, so getting to that stage is like, okay, once I can start to see the top come together and it's, like, getting closer and closer to me getting to do my favorite
Yeah.
part, I'm like, "Yeah, go faster."
Yeah,
So,
I think quilting is my favorite part too. I've never used a long arm, but um, I don't know. I just love seeing it come alive when you add that stitching in.
yeah, it gives it such a personality and, like, I think that's what's so fun about it to me is, like, okay, I've made someone's pattern, and I love it, obviously, or I wouldn't have made it, and I've got the fabrics I love, but putting a pantograph on it, or even if it's just straight line stitching, like, it still gives it such a fun personality and, like, brings it to life and gives it it's like, now you can go be what you're meant to be.
I actually really love straight line stitching. I
I
think
do
it's
too.
underrated. It's just so crisp.
Mhm.
I don't know. Big
Yeah.
fan.
Yeah. No, I am too. I really do like it. I sometimes I feel guilty when I do straight line stitching since I have, like, a huge catalog of pantographs to use, like, in my computerized machine, but yeah, that crispness of just some straight line quilting is just so nice. I like it. And I think too, like, that's, like, another point of contention sometimes for people is like, "Well, if you're not long arming your quilt, then you're not really quilting it." Or some people are like, "Well, if you're long arming your quilt, you're not really quilting it." And it's like, just let people do what they wanna do.
I don't understand that argument. Like, who cares?
I know.
If you're using a pattern, then are you even making a quilt then? Like, I don't know.
Mhm.
I think you can use the logic multiple ways and just create. Like, who cares what anyone else is doing? Just make something. Like,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like, don't get all busy about someone else's stuff, like, it doesn't matter, but yeah, I like mixed modes, mixed methods. I think it's fun and, you know, pantographs are good, and I love when I see, like, people mixing, like, they will do a pantograph, but then they'll go in and add some hand stitching to kinda enhance
yeah.
different parts of the quilt, or when they do big stitch binding. I still have never done that, but I watch, Sarah Maid do it all the time, and she just puts stars in the binding on her starry quilt, and I was like, "Ma'am, this is too much cuteness," but it's
Yeah, I
just fun.
love hand binding, but I don't think I could I know what you're talking about with the star stitching. I don't
Mhm.
think I'd have the patience for that.
Yeah.
I can
Nope.
sit at my machine and quilt like 10 hours on a quilt, but hand binding that, I don't know, each person can do
Yeah.
love leaning into each, part of the process, so
Right. Yeah. Well, and I've seen 2 bits where people have just like, they've attached their binding and finished it by machine, but then they've gone back and added some hand stitching or, like, big stitch into it just to, like, give it some embellishment. And I was like, "Oh, I might be able to do that," like, because 'cause I'm not one to sit and hand bind a quilt. I will if it's, like, a client's request or if it's, more appropriate for the type of quilt, but for my own, you won't catch me dead. Like, I've done it, I know how to do it, I'm good at it, I just don't like it.
no,
So,
I love it.
yeah,
It
and
makes
my
sense because I mean, the hand part of it is what brought me to quilting, so,
right,
yeah.
right. I was gonna say that hand part is probably, like, where you kinda spark back into that
I
previous
also
love.
I also don't think I realized that you could machine bind a quilt for the longest time because everyone in my family hands bind, so, like, when I've seen a quilt, it's just like, "Well, yeah, of course that's what you do."
Mhm.
So it took me a while to be like, "Oh, you can do it another way."
Yeah,
But still, I still love
yeah,
binding.
yeah. I didn't know you could either because when I was learning and my friends were helping me, they would well, Beth my friend Beth did the binding on my first quilt, but then after that, she's like, "You have to learn," and I was like, "I don't want to." But she made me, and that was smart of her, so she didn't get stuck binding all my quilts, um but yeah, I didn't really even know you could machine bind until I was on, like, my 4th quilt, and I don't remember if it was Miranda that said it or if I just was like, "I'm just gonna sew this on I'm gonna buy coordinating thread to the thread color I used for the long arming, but then I'm gonna stitch it on by machine." I was like, "I can do that, right?" And they were like, "Yeah, I think so." Like, it wasn't, like, a super popular idea even just, like, 6 or 7 years ago, so the fact that it's, like, there's so many now I know that there's so many different ways of binding, and I just want my quilt finished, so I just do it by machine, but, slow stitching is fun, and I think, like, that's where EPP comes in, and, like, small projects I think I'm fine with. I kinda get bored, and I think that's why I don't like piecing because I'm like, "Okay, I'm tired of making flying geese," or, "I'm tired of making half square triangles," like, I just wanna get to making the main block, I wanna get to the bigger parts that go faster, and yeah, but again, like, I don't ever look down on anything that anybody does to their own quilt, like, do it how you want, who cares, like, like, none of it is meant in disrespect of anybody else, it's just my personal preference, and I think sometimes people get caught up in that, like, the fussiness of it, like, "You're disrespecting the old ways," and I'm like, "I'm not, though," like, I know that they're there, I know how to do I know how to do a lot of things traditionally, I just choose not to, and there's room for both, like, and all of it, not just 2 ways, but all the ways, so
Feel like it's recognizing that, hey, this person actually had time to carve out for themselves and they actually took it. Like, just let them make stuff.
yeah, exactly. I'm all for just being grateful that I have the ability to do the thing I wanna do, but and also for anybody else, like, cheering each other on. It's not a competition, and there's no right or wrong way to approach it, so the more we see kind of unconventional things or a mix of all of it, I think the better off we're gonna be, and I think the better off the quilting industry will be because we're making, patterns and fabrics and ways to do it more approachable and more available to more people. The accessibility is huge.
Yeah, you can't innovate if you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's the same in science. It's the same in anywhere really, you know, I don't know. It makes sense to me. So it's like funny when people can't see that or when they're so stuck that they refuse to see it almost like no, if we don't keep moving forward or don't allow for change or growth, then this is gonna die. It will die. It will go away if we don't make it more accessible and more open and available. So I don't know. Just my humble opinions, but I don't know if humble's the right word, but whatever.
yeah.
So now that you have your new pattern out, do you have any other kind of in the wings, in the works, or are you gonna just ride on that one for a little bit
Yeah,
until
I
this
actually have two in the works. So
wow.
Saros was really weird because it was commissioned by a quilt shop back in the summer, and
Oh.
it's all kept under wraps. And so I finished that in November. And so I've had time now to like work on new stuff while this is just like sat until I was allowed releasing it myself.
Mhm.
So like today I'm shipping off my cover quilt for my next pattern to get long armed. And it's just like, how am I this ahead? Uh,
Wow.
but I don't know, that's actually part of it. But
Ooh.
or a sample block for the new pattern. It's very more traditional pattern, I'd say.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know. It's been a weird time where I'm just like I feel very planned out for quilt patterns for the next little while, where it's just like things have just taken me longer than they normally do, which is fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's nice having Saros out. Feels like a big check off of the to-do list.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think I want to take a little bit of a break and just kind of like lean into whatever I'm sewing next. Can be tiring, I think, just always like looking for the next pattern when sometimes you just want to sew and
Mhm.
do whatever you want, not think
Sure.
about it from a business point of view. But um, yeah.
Sure. That makes sense, and that's so crazy that you had to sit on that pattern for so long. So, how did that work? Did they was yeah, like, how did, like,
Oh,
did you
so
said a quilt shop commissioned that pattern, the Saros pattern for you?
yeah, so they had a Christmas quilt box. And so that's why everything was kept secret because they were
Oh,
being gifted and they didn't want the pattern revealed before Christmas. And so they had exclusive rights to it until the end of January this month. So
okay.
yeah, so
Okay.
it was, yeah, part of a quilt kit that they had put together for their customers.
So that's fun, and so were the customers, like did they have to keep it under were they asked to keep
No,
it
no, no,
under
they
wraps
weren't
until
kept. No, no.
okay.
I think I had people reach out to me being like, "Hey, this is the pattern, cool." I never saw anything on social media, but that's
Yeah.
fine. But yeah, like, it was just like a weird release because I've never done anything secret like this before, and then, like, generally you get, like, feedback as you go, and this was just, like, totally, like, silent.
Yeah.
So but
Yeah.
it was definitely a cool experience to be a part of.
Yeah. That's really cool. And the fact that they reached out to you and were like, "We want you to do this for us." Like, that's really fun.
Yeah, it was very stressful.
I'm sure.
'Cause, like, I've never had to quilt on a deadline, and I think it takes me about 3 to 4 months once I have an idea to turn it into a pattern,
Mm.
by the time I've done all the math and made the samples and all of that, and so this was a little on the short time frame for me, so it's just like, "Okay, I gotta get this all done," and so it was, stressful that way, but it was still a cool experience and very humbling, and I learned a lot about how I work and process and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, when it's like you're crunched for time, you almost have to like reassess how you do things to figure out if you can fit everything into that time frame and
Yeah.
it's
Which is like, "Hey, I have to have this done, and I have to have it tested by this date," and, like,
yeah.
these are hard deadlines.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting and so cool and like yeah, I when you feel like you've worked ahead enough that you're kind of like, "Oh, I don't have to rush on this next thing I'm doing." Like it feels really nice and like I'm always quilting on a deadline, so it's it is kind of relaxing when it's like, "Oh, I've worked ahead enough that like I don't have to rush to get this next one done. I can actually take my time on it or,
Yeah.
you know, not freak out every day because I have to get so much done that it's like a panic mode, but I think I make things worse in my own head most of the time, but
I do the same thing, like, with my own patterns, just like, "Okay, I need to, like, release it by this date," but, like, it's a self-imposed date, like,
yeah.
I'm stressing myself out for no reason, so
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, like, when you're kinda your own boss in certain aspects, like, for your pattern writing or, my quilting business, it's like, right, nobody's gonna tell me what to do next, like, I have to figure that part out,
yeah.
and self-imposed deadlines are funny because it's like, "Oh, I gotta do all this," and I'm like, "Oh, I'm the one who decided when this was gonna be
Yeah.
done," or that this was the finished date, so I can actually I have room to extend it a little, like, it's just funny because I, like, start to get frantic and I'm like, "Oh, right, I'm the boss."
Yeah, and, like, for me, Prairie and Ocean, it's not my day job,
Right.
so, like, I have the flexibility to move things around if I want, and I just sometimes I just don't, and it's just like, "Why am I doing this?"
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I wonder too, like, if maybe does it feel like what am I trying to ask? Does it feel like there's kind of pressure because you wanna make sure to, like, keep up with pattern releases so that, like what am I trying to ask? I don't wanna, like, come across I'm not trying to be rude either, so I'm like not that it's a rude question.
I don't think I'm, like, comparing myself to other people, like,
Okay.
I don't have a number that I'm just like, "Hey, this
Okay.
year I need to have a pattern per quarter," whatever.
Yeah.
Um, very much started this business as, like, a challenge to myself
Mhm.
to see if I could do it,
Yeah.
and as a way to have fun because I genuinely enjoy writing patterns.
Yeah.
Um, it makes my brain happy making things align in a document. It's
Yeah.
weird. I genuinely enjoy that part of it. And so really it more feels like I'm competing with myself, just being like, okay, like these are goals that I made for myself and I want to fulfill them. But
Okay.
if
Yeah.
I don't meet them, it's not a big deal.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for being able to interpret what I was trying to ask you because I could not get the words out right. But yeah, it's just interesting because I think sometimes and like, I've chatted about this with other people too, but I think that like kind of keeping up with other people can be really destructive sometimes, but also if you're not working for anybody else in that sense, if it's just for your own enjoyment because you really truly do love doing it, if that's your why and you can keep that in your focus, like I think it's easy to not fall into that trap. But
Yeah. I think I've been doing this long enough now too that I can, like, I know that it takes me 3 or 4 months to take a pattern from start to finish. So,
yeah,
like, realistically, I'm only going to get 3 or 4 patterns out a year,
yeah,
like, maximum. And so, like, if I don't reach like, if someone releases 5 patterns, why would I compare myself to that when I know that's not feasible with my life?
right,
So, I don't
right.
know. Makes sense.
Yeah. No, I like that. And the like the comparison game can be really hard, like I just said, but also like I think sometimes people can tend to lie to themselves and say like overestimate their abilities, I think, because they want to be seen as like a producer or an influencer of some kind, or, it's like those little things can get caught up, but that like self-awareness is so important and keeping yourself in alignment with your own life and your own goals. And so I love to see it. I love to hear when people are like already in that way because it can be such a slippery slope and so it's great to hear that you know yourself enough to know like how to balance that for yourself because quilting not being your full-time job too is like you have to be more focused on when you work on it and know those limits because if not then you know things get jumbled real easy.
I think the harder part is, like, realizing what a successful pattern is,
Mhm.
and, like, I try not to put numbers on that, but it's really hard not to. So, like, if there's this many sales for a pattern, then maybe it's a failure, if it's a success, but in the end, I would have been making this quilt anyways.
Yeah.
Like, the enjoyment comes through creating, and so if it doesn't resonate with a bunch of people, that's fine, but, like, it resonated with me, and it was, like, a joy to make myself. So,
Yeah.
I try to keep that part in mind.
Yeah. That's good. I like it.
So,
And I think too, when you stay true to yourself and in your pattern creation, it comes through and it resonates with people that way. And over time, you end up building your community, however many strong that is. It's like your people will find you because whatever you're creating speaks to them and you can only do that by being honest and true to yourself. And so it's and yours, they all resonate. They all feel like they feel cohesive and not that they're all the same by any means, but just that they feel like there's true intention behind them and they're not like anything else. So it's a really unique and lovely collection of patterns that you've shared. So
yeah, they're definitely kinda all over the place.
they're amazing. Like, but I think that's even though they to you may seem all over the place, it's like I can see how they came from the same person, if that makes sense.
A little bit. I feel like the science part of me is just like, I just put lines together. Like, I have a lot harder understanding that aspect of art.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I mean, whatever you're doing is working, so it doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's so awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today, and I've just been so excited to talk to you. You came highly recommended uh, from Erin at Seam Ripper Society. She was like, "You need to talk to Janice. She's just so cool." And I was like, "Sounds good. I like it."
Yeah, I chat with Erin right before this. I'm just like, "Hey, you recommended me." So,
Yeah,
hey.
yeah. Kitty. Oh, she's so cute. I
Yeah,
love
yeah.
cats. I'm also a cat mom, so
She is the star of Prairie and Ocean, I'm pretty sure.
yeah, she comfort tests all your quilts?
She, like, does quality control on every single piece of fabric that goes into every quilt.
Mm.
Right before this call, I spent about 10 minutes, lint brushing my Saros sample because she had made a nest out of it. So, just, extra batting is what I say.
Yeah. It's just gonna be extra warm now.
Exactly, sorry.
That's so funny. Well, so if, any listeners don't know how to get to you online, how can they find your patterns and find you?
On Instagram at prairieandocean.com or on my website, same thing, oh, I guess Instagram isn't prairieandocean.com. That's the website, but Instagram is Prairie and Ocean.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So I will put links to that in the show notes so people can get to your Instagram and your website easily and check out your patterns. And other than that, I can't wait to see what you come up with next. And hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Bye.